Hey, City Center Church, so glad that you are with us today. Man, no matter where you're watching from, if you're watching all the way on the East Coast, come on, I want to give it up for you guys. You guys are actually meeting this morning in person, and so excited about that. If you haven't got connected with our East Coast team there in Bethlehem, want to encourage you, engage. We want to get connected with you. If you're here on the West Coast, man, so glad that you are with us also. We have gatherings every Sunday also. And so we want to encourage you, man, to be a part. We're about getting connected with people. We want to engage with you. We want you to know that this is a safe space for you to belong way before you ever believe. So again, we are so glad that you are with us today. Man, we are continuing our series on Doubters Club. And today I want to talk to you about dominating fear and doubt. Come on, no matter where you're watching from, we know that we all deal with doubt and fear in our lives. We all deal with it. There's things that come up in our life, even with everything going on with Ukraine, in wars, in rumors of war. There is doubt, there's fear, there's just things that cause us to get frustrated and nervous. And so I want to talk to you today about a principle of dominating fear and doubt. And before we do that, I want to encourage you, man, our team's going to put up a QR code. And as you go throughout your gathering today, you can scan that QR code and you can just give us just a little bit of information about who you are and what you're going through. And so, man, if we haven't met, my name is Raymond. I'm the pastor here. And I can think about all throughout my life where I've dealt with fear and I've dealt with doubt. These last few weeks, we've been talking about this series on doubt. I want to encourage you to go back and watch it. Last week, we talked about deconstruction and how doubt of who God is, our faith, who created, man, is something that impacts all of us. But today I want to talk about just the personal fears and doubts that we all walk through. And it reminds me of when me and our family first made a decision to move from the Midwest to move to California. And I remember just thinking, just the fear and the doubt that came up within us as we're thinking about leaving what we know, the area that we know, the community that we're in, to then for us follow God's calling to come to California. And just that alone caused some fear and doubt within us. And then to top it all off, when we arrive to California, we actually lose everything. So all of our stuff gets taken and we're stuck in this place of asking, okay, like have we made the right decision? And there's been times when I've joked about it and said, man, I knew that God had called us here for a reason. And that's why these things were happening. But still in the midst of that, the question is not, did God call us? The question is, man, will he continue to be faithful in it, right? Because when you're asking that question, that actually brings up within you doubt of, is God good enough? So when I think about that, it's like he is with us even when we're going through doubts, but still the doubts arise and we can't see him. So even though he's with us, it's hard to see him. And then you maybe ask questions like, is he trustworthy even when circumstances are not trustworthy? Or if you don't get what we want, right? Or if we're thinking about, for me, if things don't turn out exactly the way I want them, can I still trust them? And so I believe we're all impacted by fears and doubt. And maybe you have questions like that also. Maybe it's, is God truly bigger than my doubts? Like, is God truly capable of handling all the doubts that I have? Is he capable of helping me in time of need? And as I think about our family and moving to California, it was like, man, like we lost everything. Like, God, can you actually show up? Are you actually listening to me? Are you actually trustworthy? And I can remember even while asking those questions that God used two of our friends to actually start a GoFundMe for us and helped to bring some trust in the midst of it. But that doesn't change the doubts that we deal with. But here are some statements I believe to be true about God. Even if you walked in here and you don't know who God is, or if you're dealing with, man, is God truly faithful? Here's some statements I want you to think about. He wants and knows what's best for you, even if you don't see it. Even if you don't see it, I believe that to be true. Number two is this: when faced with doubts and fear, when we think he's not listening to our crisis for help, here's two key key things. He never leaves us and never forsakes us. His ears are attentive to our cries, to the cries of his people. I believe that everyone who walked in here today would love to have a cure for dominating fears and doubts. But you're asking this question, like, what do we do when these statements aren't enough? When you hear, okay, God is with us, when you hear he's faithful, when you hear that he's trustworthy, but your circumstances and the things that you're walking through right now do not show that he is, what do? We want answers to our doubts, don't you? Like, we want answers to why God allows these things to happen. We want answers to know, should I take this step? How can I overcome my fear when God is nowhere to be found? How can I overcome my doubts when he's not answering me? Like, how can I overcome my doubts when he did not come through for the sick loved one? Like, you can just name it, go down the list. If you have a marriage that you're going through, you're asking, like, man, God, can I actually trust you? Are you actually trustworthy? It's funny when I think of things like this, even the circumstance that we went through as a family, it causes me to think back on John 16:3. And it's a passage found in the New Testament. And John writing here, he says this, he says, I've told you, well, Jesus was speaking, but John wrote this down, but he says, I've told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world, he says, you will have trouble. Let's pause there. Hashtag, like, go figure, right? He states it. Jesus says, hey, you will have trouble. So what he's not saying is that you'll never go through anything. But here's the cool thing. But he says, but take heart, I have overcome the world. When we're faced with our fears and our doubts, I want you to know that there's a Jesus, there's a God who overcomes your fears and doubts with the fact that he is with you, that he has the power to overcome those circumstances and situations and walk with you, through it. Don't tell anyone I said this, except for this is digital and people can hear this, right? But doubts and fears and questions are have-tos. They are have-tos when it comes to faith. Here's what Craig Groeschel said. He said this in his book, Divine Direction. Doubt is not the end of faith, but the beginning of it. I'll say it again. He says, doubt is not the end of faith, but the beginning of it. Look at this. He says this, greater doubters actually have the capacity to be good people of faith. Your capacity to have faith in God gets larger as you go through stuff. Go figure, right? So he's making this statement that, man, when you're actually walking through difficult and hard times where you actually have to trust in God, when you actually have to put your faith to the test, your faith actually grows larger and bigger. So don't shy from your fears and your doubts, but run to them because they're have-tos. Because doubt's not the end of faith, but the beginning of it. But here's the other thing that I learned about faith and doubts and fears. There's actually a part that we have to play in the things that we're walking through. And so here's the thought. Obedience can be our steps of faith. Man, if we're going to take steps of faith when we're dealing with doubts and fears, let obedience be your step of faith. And what is obedience? Obedience is not action in the absence of doubt, but it's action taken in faith in the midst of doubts and fears. I'm going to read it again. Obedience is not action in the absence of doubt. It's action taken in faith in the midst of doubt and fears. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at a story found in Judges chapter 6. And the story today is found where the Israelites have been in persecution for the last 7 years. So they've been in persecution for the last 7 years, searching for the waymaker, dealing with fears and doubts and stresses, living daily with all of those things. And they knew that God was a waymaker. They knew that God was in control and capable of accomplishing things. But they would ask God, what have you done for me lately? Have you ever had that moment where God's maybe shown up for you, or you've heard an answer, or things have been good, but at this moment you're like, man, well, what have you done for me lately? Because they were being oppressed. Maybe you've been oppressed, but in this story in Judges chapter 6, you find that the Israelites are being oppressed. And so although God had done many things for them in the past, they're wondering now, like, what are you going to do for me? Because right now, Midian is coming up against us. Maybe you have been crying daily for help also. It's the same thing that the Israelites were doing, crying daily for help and not getting an answer. They only heard of the power of God, but they had not experienced it. And I think there's times in our lives when we're dealing with fears and doubts that we've heard about how good God is, or we've seen him do good things in the past, or we have not seen him do anything. And we're just wondering, like I've heard of your power, but can you actually help my marriage? God, I've heard of your power, but can you actually help my sickness? God, I've heard of your power. Can you actually help my anxiety? Like, I've heard of your power, but right now I don't have money in my bank account. Like, what am I going to do? Have you ever been there before? And so in this moment, God, in the midst of the cries of the people, God calls a man named Gideon, who I would say is just like each and every one of us, dealing with fears and doubts. And this story is so practical for our lives. And so we're going to jump into a lot of verses today, but I'm going to encourage you to lean in. It's going to be up on the screen, but it starts this way. Judges chapter 6, we're going to start verse 7 and 10. It says this: when they cried out to the Lord, and I'm sure you have had moments where you cried out to the Lord because Midian was oppressing them. The Lord sent a prophet to the Israelites. He said, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel says. I brought you up out of slavery in Egypt. I rescued you from the Egyptians." He's speaking about all the things that he's done for the Israelites in the past, but at that moment they had amnesia to God's power, and sometimes we have that. So I rescued you from the Egyptians and from all the oppressed, all who oppressed you. He says, I drove out your enemies and gave you their land. I told you, I am the Lord your God. You must not worship the gods of the Amorites, in whose land you now live, but you have not listened to me. And so, as we talked about obedience and as being a step of faith, they were not being obedient to what was asked of them. Then it goes on and says, then the angel of the Lord came and sat beneath the great tree of the Oprah, which belonged to Hosea, the clan of Abiezer. And Gideon, son of Joash, was threshing wheat at the bottom of the winepress to hide the grain from the Midianites. And what you have to understand about this story is that in the midst of the oppression, we find Gideon in this story, who's the main person in the story, who God's going to use, but he's in fear, he's in doubt, he doesn't trust if God is actually faithful, and so he's hiding from the Midianites in the threshing floor, threshing wheat so that he could not be caught. So this is not someone who's walking in all faith and trust, but he's walking in fear. But the angel of the Lord appeared to him and said this, mighty hero, the Lord is with you. Sir, Gideon replied, if the Lord is with us, have you had those moments, the if moments? Then he says, why? Have you had like the why moments? Why has all this happened to us? I remember when we lost all of our stuff, it's the question like, why, God, would you allow this to happen to us? We're working for you. And he says this, and where are all the miracles our ancestors told us about? So like we've heard of God, your great power, but we don't know, we don't see you right now. There's people dying all around the world, God, and you say you're powerful, but I can't see it right now. My marriage is falling apart and I can't see your hand. I've got family members who are sick and I can't see your hand. Do you know what I'm talking about? Have you been there before? Well, this story, this is where Gideon is. He's right there where you could be today. The Lord brought us up out of Egypt, but now the Lord has abandoned us and handed us over to the Midianites. Then the Lord turned to him and said, go with strength you have and rescue Israel from the Midianites. So God is telling Gideon, who's in the threshing floor, hiding from the Midianites, to go, for I am with you. And he says this, my clan, Gideon says this, replied, how can I rescue Israel, right? He's dealing with fear and doubt. My clan is the weakest in all, in the whole tribe of Manasseh, and I am the least in my entire family line. Why don't you pause for a moment? I'm going to pray, and then we're going to jump into just a little bit more information about this story. We're going to got more verses to read and then some quick points. And so God, today, man, as we're all dealing with fear and doubt, help us to find the ability to dominate our fear and doubt, like Gideon sitting in the threshing floor, threshing wheat, hiding from the Midianites because he's afraid and fearful and he's wondering where God is because he hasn't seen you. God, help this story to encourage us to be obedient, to have faith even in difficulty. So God, we give you all praise and honors in Jesus' name, amen. So what you have to understand is Gideon was filled with fear and doubt, and he was asked by God to have faith in the midst of difficulty. And I believe that we all know how difficult that is. I want to ask you, what are you the most fearful of in your life right now? Like, what are the things that you are the most fearful of? Is it potentially your future, that you could be alone? Are you fearful right now that you'll never make it out of your problem or your circumstance? Are you fearful that you'll lose everything? Are you fearful that someone will see you fail? Are you fearful that you don't have control? I want you to know that in this story, Gideon felt all those things throughout the story. But God, like a loving father, keeps doing a few things. He keeps telling him, I know the future, trust me. He keeps telling him, you are not alone, I am with you. He keeps telling them, I am bigger than your problems. And I believe God is saying that to you today, that you don't have to walk in fear and doubt, because God is bigger than the problems that you face. He says he owns everything. When you are weak, Gideon said, I'm weak. God is strong. And also understand that God is in control when circumstances seem out of control. So I want to encourage you today to exchange your doubts for a revelation of how powerful our God is. This next part of the story that we're getting ready to read is more than a test of faith, but a test of obedience. Sometimes we feel like we're being tested in our faith, but you're actually being tested in your obedience to God. Obedience is a faith declaration of who you know God to be. Look at Moses places his staff over the ocean. This is a story in the Bible, and it gets part over the sea and it gets parted. Daniel only whispered the true, worshiped the true God. It was obedience. Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego did not put any other gods before the Lord. Another step of obedience. Servants filled up water and it was turned into wine. That was their step of obedience. Jesus went to the cross being obedient to God. Not my will, but your will be done. We see all throughout Scripture that is littered with people who, when faced with fear and doubt, were obedient. And the secret sauce to dominating your fear and doubt is being obedient to what God says. So the story goes on. The Lord said to Gideon, we are fast forwarding to chapter 7, where Gideon becomes this man of faith, and he's obedient to what God is asking them to do. And so God asks this crazy thing. He says, the Lord said to Gideon, you have too many warriors. And so the Israelites are getting ready to fight, and they're getting ready to go into a battle, and he has not even enough warriors to fight the army that he's already getting ready to fight. But yet God starts the story off with saying, you have too many warriors. And so let's jump in. He says, if I let all of you fight the Midianites, the Israelites will boast to me that they have saved themselves by their own strength. Sometimes your situation gets worse only for God to better display his power. Sometimes you're faced with things in your life right now that are there so that you can see, oh, it was only by God that I made it through. And so verse 3, it goes on, therefore tell the people, whoever is timid or afraid may leave this mountain and go home. So the 22,000 soldiers of them went home. 22,000 of his army went home, leaving only 10,000 whoever willing to fight. So that means what? He had 32,000 men to fight an army way larger, and then 22,000 left. Come on, would that not be a circumstance where you would be like, man, I'm afraid, I'm scared? And so this is that story. So he only had 10,000 left. The army against him was mighty. Instead of getting easier because of the soldiers that he had, it got harder. But here's the thing, sometimes God says he is with you, yet things get harder and worse. Like Gideon, your fear rises, your trust in God needs to grow in the midst of that difficulty. Here's what Gideon said in the story. Maybe you've had a moment like this. He says, but the Lord told Gideon, there are still too many. So listen here, God cut his army down to 20. And he still says his army is too long. The army was, the army was in this difficult place. And yet God continues to make his job harder. So the story goes on. He says, bring them down to the spring, then I will test them and to determine who will go with you Not who of the 32,000. Now it's down to 10,000. Still cutting his army. When Gideon took the warriors down to the water, the Lord told him, divide the men into two groups. In one group, put all those who cup water in their hands and lap it up with their tongues like dogs. In the other group, put all those who kneel down and drink with their mouths to the stream. And out of the 10,000, only 300 of the men drank with their hands. All the others got down on their knees and drank with their mouths to the stream. And the Lord told Gideon, with these 300 men, I will rescue you and give you victory over the Midianites. Send all the others home. I don't know about you, but at this moment, I would be like, God, are you crazy? Like, do you not understand what I'm going through? Like, my circumstances getting worse and worse. Not only did God call him to follow, but he put him in the face to face with the impossible. And I believe that there are times in life when God does that also, where the only thing that he could do and the only thing that we can do is rely on God. But yet, when our situations get worse and worse and our minds are filled with doubt, here's my main point for you today. When this happens, I believe obedience is a faith declaration that you believe in the power of God when doubt and fear makes you to question the plan of God. So my main point, when this happens, when you're faced with fears and doubts and you don't know how you're going to make it through, it's this, that obedience is a faith declaration that you believe in the power of God when doubt and fear makes you question the plan of God. Come on. Gideon had to be afraid. He had to be asking God, I came here with 33,000 men. Now you cut me down to 300 men. Like, what do I do? And so I want to talk to you about how do you dominate fear and doubt in your life. Number one is this. If you want to dominate fear and doubt, you have to trust that God is at work in ways you can't see, doing far more than you will ever know to bless you in ways far greater than you can imagine. This is a long point, but it is a transformative, declarative, something you can write on your wall. But number one, trust that God is at work in ways you can't see, doing far more than you will ever know to bless you in ways far greater than you can imagine. I love Ephesians 3:20 that says, now all glory to God who is able through his mighty power at work within us to accomplish infinitely more than we might ask or think. Man, Gideon was faced with difficulty, but he could trust in God because he was working in ways that Gideon could not see. Number two is this. I want to encourage you to replace the lie of your doubts and fears for the truth of God's promises. What lies are you believing in your life? Don't speak it into existence. Those doubts and those fears, that anxiety, that stress, you don't feel like things are ever going to work out or going to make it. I want to encourage you, don't allow those lies to trap you. Living under the bondage of debt, you can't get out, but you can. Parents where kids are not doing good and you feel like they are never going to do good. Don't say that. My kids are teenagers and they're always fighting. I don't feel like it will get better. No, walk in faith. Spouse does not look at you the way they used to, and fights keep rising up and you're like, man, our marriage will never go back the way it used to. Don't allow the lie of your doubts and fears to be replaced the truth of God's promises. And lastly is this, be obedient today, trusting God to take care of tomorrow. I believe that when you're faced with fear and doubts, if you will be obedient today, trusting God to take care of your tomorrows, nothing will be impossible. As we look at the end of this, another part of the story, the night the Lord said to Gideon, take the second bull from your father's herd, pull down your father's altar to Baal and cut down the Asherah pole standing beside it. Then build an altar to the Lord your God here on its hillside sanctuary, laying the stones carefully. Sacrifice the bull as a burnt offering on the altar, using as fuel the wood of Asherah pole you cut down. You may ask the question, like, what does that even have anything to do with what we're talking about? Gideon chose to be obedient, even though everyone else was going against what God asked him. And that obedience is what God used in his life to build up his faith. And so my one last thought before we close today is this. Remember that ordinary people can do extraordinary things, but God can do the impossible. Maybe right now you're faced with impossible situations, impossible doubts, impossible fears, impossible anxiety, impossible strength, an impossible marriage, an impossible relationship, an impossible financial situation, an impossible diagnosis. Like whatever the diagnosis is, I would encourage you first just to be obedient to God. Be obedient. Be obedient today. Stay obedient today. Trusting God will take care of your tomorrows, but also realize that you serve a God of the impossible. And even when faced with fear and doubts, as Jesus said in that passage in John, man, you're going to go through troubles. We're going to go through trials. But take faith, for God has overcome the world. God is the God of the impossible. And so whatever impossible situation that you're in, I don't know about you, but I want to be hanging out with the God of the impossible, the God who can accomplish exceeding and abundantly more than we can ever ask, think, or imagine. And so today, I want to encourage you, although this gathering is a little bit longer today, that if you want to dominate your fear and you want to dominate your doubt, number one, I want you to trust that God is at work in ways you can't see, doing far more than you will ever know to bless you in ways far greater than you can imagine. Number two is this: I want to encourage you to replace the lie of your doubts and fears for the truth of God's promises. And then lastly, a big one, be obedient today and every day, trusting God to take care of your tomorrows. I love Proverbs 21:31 that says, the horse is prepared for battle, for the day of battle, but victory belongs to the Lord. Man, stay prepared, stay obedient, and victory will come from God. I love Philippians 4:13 that says this: for I can do everything through Christ who gives me the strength. You walked in here to our gathering today and you're struggling with fear and doubt, doubting if God can actually help you through what you're walking through. I want you to know, man, He can. He's the God of the impossible. He's not saying that you'll never go through anything, but He's saying that He will always be with you, never leave you. When your odds seem bigger than the capability of what you have, man, that's when God shows up. When the circumstance seems out of your control, that's when God shows up. And so when you're faced with fear and doubts and you don't know how you're going to make it, be obedient. Take your faith step of following and trusting God, and He'll never leave you nor forsake you. Well, hey, we're so glad that you're with us in our gathering, week 3 of our series. We're going to end this series next week, and then we'll be jumping into a new series. But we're so glad that you're with us today. I want to encourage you to engage in our after party, which will be after this gathering if you're watching this live. If you're watching this on replay, man, we want to get engaged and connected with you. We'll put the QR code back up on the screen. I want to encourage you to take a little bit of time to get connected with us. Well, hey, we are so glad that you joined us this morning. Can't wait to see you next week. Have a wonderful